The winter of 1692 settled quietly over the small Puritan village of Salem, Massachusetts. Snow rested on the rooftops, narrow paths disappeared beneath layers of ice, and the cold wind whispered through bare trees that surrounded the settlement. The people who lived there believed that every moment of life was watched by God, and every hardship carried a lesson. Their days began before sunrise with prayer, hard work, and simple meals. Life was predictable, disciplined, and deeply connected to faith. Yet beneath the peaceful appearance, fear quietly existed in every household. The colony had endured wars, disease, failed harvests, and uncertainty for years. Every strange sound in the forest, every unexpected illness, and every unexplained event seemed capable of carrying a hidden meaning. Few people questioned those beliefs because they had grown up hearing that the devil constantly searched for ways to tempt ordinary men and women. In such a world, even the smallest mystery could become something much larger than anyone expected. Salem was not a wealthy town. Most families depended on farming, raising livestock, gathering firewood, and helping one another survive the long New England winters. Houses were built close together, yet neighbors did not always trust one another. Land disputes had lasted for years. Arguments over property lines, inheritance, and church leadership quietly divided families that appeared friendly during Sunday worship. Some villagers wished the community would become more prosperous, while others believed strict religious traditions should never change. These disagreements rarely became public, but they shaped the way people viewed one another. A careless word could be remembered for years. A disagreement over a fence or a field might quietly become a lasting resentment. Nobody imagined that these old conflicts would one day influence decisions that would change countless lives forever. Among the families living in Salem was the household of Reverend Samuel Parris, the minister of the village church. His home stood as one of the most respected places in town because religion guided nearly every part of daily life. The minister's sermons reminded everyone that temptation existed everywhere and that Satan constantly sought opportunities to deceive believers. His words were not unusual for the time. Throughout New England, ministers often warned their congregations about the dangers of sin, evil spirits, and eternal punishment. Most villagers accepted these teachings without question. They believed that protecting their community required unwavering faith and constant vigilance. It was a world where spiritual concerns were often considered just as real as physical dangers. Inside the Parris household lived two young girls, whose lives seemed ordinary until everything suddenly changed. During the cold months, they began behaving in ways that no one could explain. At first, the changes seemed small. They appeared distracted during conversations and struggled to focus on simple tasks. Soon they cried unexpectedly, complained of invisible pains, and reacted with unusual fear to things that others could not see. Their movements became unpredictable, and their strange behavior frightened the adults around them. Family members tried comforting them, but nothing seemed to help. Neighbors soon heard stories about the children, and curiosity quickly spread throughout the village. The local physician examined the girls carefully. He searched for signs of illness that might explain their condition, but medicine in the 17th century was limited. Without finding a physical cause, he reluctantly suggested another possibility. If the sickness could not be explained naturally, perhaps it had a supernatural origin. Those few words carried enormous weight in a deeply religious community. Almost immediately, conversations throughout Salem changed. What had begun as concern for two children slowly became fear that unseen forces might already be working inside the village. Families whispered together after sunset. Parents watched their children more closely. Church attendance became even more important as everyone searched for reassurance. Fear has a remarkable way of changing ordinary conversations. Before long, neighbors began sharing stories they had never considered important before. Someone remembered hearing strange noises outside a barn during the previous autumn. Another recalled livestock behaving unusually during the winter. A farmer described crops that had failed unexpectedly. None of these events had seemed connected at the time, but fear encouraged people to weave them into a single explanation. Human minds naturally search for patterns during uncertain times, and Salem was no exception. Every coincidence suddenly appeared meaningful. Every unanswered question seemed to point toward something darker hiding beneath the surface of everyday life. As anxiety continued growing, attention slowly shifted away from understanding the girl's condition and toward discovering who might be responsible. Instead of asking what had happened, many people began asking who had caused it. That subtle change transformed concern into suspicion. Villagers quietly observed one another during church services, community gatherings, and ordinary conversations. Expressions that once meant nothing were suddenly interpreted as signs of guilt. Silence became suspicious. Confidence appeared dangerous. Even kindness could be misunderstood if it came from someone already viewed with doubt. Without realizing it, Salem had begun walking a path where fear mattered more than evidence. No one in the village could see the future. They believed they were protecting their families, preserving their faith, and defending their community from unimaginable evil. Yet history would later remember those first weeks very differently. What appeared to many as a search for truth was slowly becoming something far more dangerous. Long before the famous trials began, before courtrooms filled with frightened witnesses and impossible accusations, the true foundation of the tragedy had already been laid. It began not with proof, but with uncertainty. It grew through fear. And once fear took hold of Salem, it became stronger than reason itself. The first accusations did not arrive with certainty. They emerged slowly, carried through frightened conversations, whispered prayers, and worried discussions around fireplaces after the sun had disappeared behind the frozen woods. Every family wanted answers, and in the absence of clear explanations, even the smallest rumor found fertile ground. The village had become unusually quiet. Children who once played together outdoors now remained close to their homes. Adults exchanged nervous glances instead of cheerful greetings. It felt as though the entire settlement was waiting for something invisible to reveal itself. The young girls continued describing terrifying experiences that no one else could witness. They claimed unseen figures appeared before them, whispered threats, and caused unbearable pain without leaving a single mark. To modern ears, such stories might sound impossible, but in 17th century Salem, many people believed the invisible world existed alongside the visible one. Ministers frequently preached that angels and demons fought an endless spiritual battle over human souls. Because those beliefs were deeply rooted in daily life, the girls' stories did not seem entirely unbelievable. Instead, they appeared to confirm fears that had already existed in the minds of many villagers. Community leaders decided they could no longer ignore the situation. If evil truly existed within Salem, then discovering its source became a sacred responsibility. Local magistrates gathered witnesses, questioned neighbors, and encouraged anyone with knowledge of suspicious events to speak openly. The atmosphere inside these meetings was tense. Every answer seemed capable of changing someone's future forever. Questions were repeated again and again. Faces were studied carefully. Long pauses were interpreted as hesitation. Even confidence could appear suspicious. The search for certainty gradually became a search for someone to blame. Before long, attention turned toward individuals who already stood apart from the rest of society. One was an enslaved woman named Tituba, who lived in Reverend Parris's household. She came from a different culture, spoke differently, and carried customs unfamiliar to most villagers. Another was Sarah Good, a homeless woman who wandered from house to house asking for food and shelter. The third was Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman whose personal choices had already made her unpopular within the community. None of them shared much in common except one important fact. They already existed on the edges of Salem society, where suspicion often settled first. When officials questioned these women, every conversation became more frightening than the last. Some denied every accusation with unwavering determination. Others faced relentless pressure from authorities demanding explanations that simply did not exist. Each answer seemed to create even more questions. The courtroom, still small and informal by modern standards, became filled with anxious observers hoping to witness the truth. Instead, they watched uncertainty grow stronger. The villagers believed they were witnessing justice in action, yet fear influenced nearly every question that was asked. As stories spread beyond Salem Village, nearby communities became increasingly alarmed. Travelers carried news from one town to another, often adding dramatic details along the way. By the time many people heard the story, the original events had already changed through repeated retelling. What began as concern over a few mysterious illnesses soon became a tale of hidden witches, secret meetings, and invisible attacks. Every retelling made the situation appear larger and more terrifying. Rumor traveled much faster than evidence, and every new listener unknowingly helped the panic expand beyond the village itself. Inside Salem, ordinary friendships began changing. Neighbors who had shared meals together for years now wondered whether someone among them might secretly serve dark forces. Families became cautious about speaking openly. Parents warned their children not to repeat private conversations outside the home. Even simple disagreements felt dangerous because no one knew how easily an angry argument might later become part of an accusation. Trust, once damaged, proved incredibly difficult to rebuild. The invisible walls separating neighbors grew higher with every passing day. The ministers of New England also found themselves facing an impossible challenge. They wished to protect their communities from genuine evil, yet they also understood the importance of fairness and justice. Some believed swift action was necessary before the situation became even worse. Others quietly questioned whether fear was beginning to overpower wisdom. Their concerns remained cautious because openly disagreeing with the growing public anxiety carried its own risks. Few people wanted to appear sympathetic toward anyone already under suspicion. Winter slowly gave way to early spring, but the changing season brought little comfort. The snow melted from the roads, revealing muddy paths between homes, yet the emotional weight hanging over Salem only became heavier. More people stepped forward claiming strange experiences. More neighbors remembered unusual encounters from months or even years earlier. Every new testimony seemed to reinforce the previous one, creating an endless chain of suspicion. Once enough people accepted the possibility that witchcraft existed among them, almost every unexplained event appeared to support that belief. Without realizing it, Salem had crossed an invisible line. The village was no longer investigating isolated incidents. It had entered a period where fear guided decisions more powerfully than facts. Every accusation encouraged another. Every confession, whether true or forced, strengthened public belief that a hidden conspiracy threatened the community. The foundation for one of the most tragic chapters in American history had now been firmly established, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Spring gradually settled over Salem, but the warmth of the season did little to ease the fear that had taken hold of the village. The frozen fields slowly revealed fresh grass, birds returned to the forests, and streams began flowing once again. Nature seemed determined to move forward, yet the people of Salem remained trapped by growing uncertainty. Every sunrise brought new conversations, new suspicions, and new stories that spread from one household to another. Instead of celebrating the arrival of spring, many families quietly wondered who might be accused next. The magistrates continued gathering testimony from anyone willing to speak. The hearings became longer, attracting larger crowds each week. People traveled from neighboring settlements simply to observe the unusual proceedings. Some arrived believing they would witness justice. Others came hoping to understand how an ordinary farming village had become the center of such extraordinary claims. Inside the crowded rooms, silence often filled the air as every witness carefully chose each word. A single sentence could influence the fate of another person. Those making accusations described encounters that could not be touched, measured, or verified. They spoke of invisible figures standing beside the accused, mysterious voices heard only by themselves, and frightening dreams that felt completely real. Whenever these stories were told, many listeners accepted them without hesitation because they fit the religious beliefs of the time. Few questioned whether fear itself might influence memory or perception. Instead, every emotional testimony strengthened the belief that unseen forces truly surrounded the community. As the investigations expanded, people who had never expected to face suspicion suddenly found themselves answering difficult questions. Some were respected church members. Others owned successful farms or businesses. Their previous reputations offered little protection. Once a person's name entered the growing list of accusations, neighbors often began remembering ordinary events in entirely different ways. A disagreement from years earlier became suspicious. A strange expression during church seemed meaningful. Even acts of kindness could be reinterpreted as attempts to hide darker intentions. Fear had changed the way people remembered the past. Families lived under constant emotional strain. Husbands worried about their wives. Parents feared for their children. Brothers and sisters quietly discussed whether speaking openly might place the entire household at risk. Every knock on the front door caused a moment of hesitation. Visitors were no longer welcomed with the same confidence as before. The village that once relied upon cooperation had become a place where uncertainty quietly influenced every conversation. Even those who doubted the accusations often remained silent, believing it was safer not to challenge public opinion. The local jail slowly filled with prisoners awaiting further examination. Conditions inside were harsh. The buildings had never been designed to hold so many people for extended periods. Families struggled to provide food and clothing for loved ones behind locked doors, while uncertainty about the future weighed heavily upon everyone involved. Some prisoners remained hopeful that truth would eventually prevail. Others feared they might never return home, regardless of their innocence. Outside the prison walls, relatives waited anxiously for any news that offered even the smallest sign of hope. Community leaders faced enormous pressure. They believed they carried the responsibility of protecting Salem from genuine danger, yet each new accusation complicated that responsibility further. If they ignored the warnings, they feared allowing evil to spread. If they accepted every accusation without question, they risked condemning innocent people. The balance between caution and justice became increasingly difficult to maintain. Decisions that once appeared straightforward now carried consequences affecting entire families and future generations. Throughout New England, news of Salem continued spreading with remarkable speed. Ministers exchanged letters discussing the unusual events. Merchants carried stories from town to town while traveling for business. Travelers often arrived with exaggerated versions of the latest developments, unintentionally adding fresh layers of mystery to an already confusing situation. By the time many communities heard the news, Salem had become a symbol of hidden dangers and spiritual conflict. Few outsiders understood how much ordinary fear and uncertainty had contributed to the growing crisis. Amid the growing panic, a small number of thoughtful voices began expressing quiet concern. They did not deny the existence of evil, but they questioned whether every accusation deserved immediate belief. They wondered whether fear, grief, personal conflict, or misunderstanding might explain at least some of the events unfolding before them. These questions were rarely asked in public because challenging the dominant opinion required considerable courage. Nevertheless, the first seeds of doubt had finally begun to appear, though they remained fragile and easily overshadowed by louder voices demanding swift action. As spring continued unfolding across the Massachusetts countryside, Salem found itself standing at a dangerous crossroads. The investigations showed no signs of slowing. More names were whispered in private conversations. More families prepared for uncertain futures. The hope that the crisis might end quickly slowly faded, replaced by the unsettling realization that the village had entered a chapter unlike anything its people had ever experienced. The coming months would test not only their faith, but also their judgment, compassion, and understanding of justice in ways no one could yet imagine. By early summer, the atmosphere in Salem had changed so completely that many longtime residents barely recognized the community they had once called peaceful. The familiar routines of planting crops, repairing fences, and preparing for the next harvest continued, but they were overshadowed by constant anxiety. Conversations that had once focused on weather, livestock, or family now centered almost entirely on the investigations. Every gathering carried an uncomfortable silence, as though everyone feared saying the wrong thing. People lowered their voices whenever unfamiliar faces appeared nearby, uncertain whether a casual remark might later be repeated before a magistrate. The courtroom itself became one of the busiest places in the village. Those called to testify entered knowing their words could permanently alter another person's life. Some witnesses spoke with absolute confidence, convinced they were protecting the community from genuine danger. Others appeared uncertain, struggling to separate what they had personally experienced from what they had merely heard from neighbors. Yet once testimony entered the official record, those differences often became less noticeable. Every statement seemed to add another stone to a growing wall of suspicion that surrounded the accused. One of the most controversial forms of testimony involved what later historians would call spectral evidence. Some witnesses claimed that although a person's physical body had remained elsewhere, an invisible spirit resembling that individual had appeared before them, causing pain or fear. Because no one else could see these supposed visions, proving or disproving such claims was impossible. To many people living in Salem, however, spiritual attacks seemed entirely believable. Their understanding of the world left room for invisible forces acting beyond ordinary human sight. As a result, accusations based on unseen experiences were often treated with alarming seriousness. Not everyone accepted these ideas without hesitation. A few respected ministers and educated observers quietly questioned whether invisible visions alone should determine someone's fate. They worried that fear might influence honest people to misinterpret dreams, nightmares, or moments of emotional distress. Their concerns were careful and measured rather than confrontational. They understood that openly rejecting the investigations could itself invite suspicion. Even so, these early doubts would eventually become important voices urging greater caution as the crisis continued. For the families of the accused, daily life became a painful exercise in uncertainty. Homes stood unusually quiet after loved ones were taken away for questioning or imprisonment. Fields were left unattended because there were too few hands available to work them. Children suddenly found themselves relying upon neighbors or relatives for food and care, while their parents faced uncertain futures. Every sunrise brought another day without answers. Some families remained hopeful that reason would prevail. Others quietly prepared themselves for outcomes they could scarcely bear to imagine. The emotional strain reached far beyond those directly accused. Friends struggled with impossible decisions. Should they speak in defense of someone they had known for years, risking suspicion themselves, or should they remain silent, hoping to protect their own families? Many chose silence, not because they believed every accusation, but because fear had become more powerful than certainty. In communities built upon close relationships, silence often spoke louder than words. It reflected not indifference, but the overwhelming pressure placed upon ordinary people living through extraordinary circumstances.